You remember the scholarship application spread across the kitchen table while your parents watched the evening news in the other room. You remember translating the FAFSA form out loud, word by word, because nobody in that house had ever seen one before. You remember the campus visit where you walked into a dining hall the size of a stadium and felt your stomach drop, not from excitement, not from fear exactly, but from something you didn't have a name for, a kind of dislocation. Like you had stepped into a country where you didn't speak the language and everyone else had been issued a phrasebook at birth. You remember coming home for Thanksgiving that first year and feeling the wrongness of the fit, not because anything had changed at home, but because something had shifted in you, and you didn't know yet if that was a good thing or a catastrophic one. You remember sitting at the table where you grew up and feeling like a guest. You remember sitting in your seminar the following Monday and feeling like an imposter. You remember holding both of those feelings at the same time and not knowing what to do with either of them. That is where this begins. The label that doesn't fit. You are technically a millennial. That is what the demographic data says. You were born somewhere between 1981 and 1996, depending on which researcher is drawing the lines, and that puts you inside a generational category that carries a very particular cultural image, one built around economic optimism followed by economic betrayal, around participation trophies and helicopter parents, around being raised to believe you were special and then discovering the labor market disagreed. But that image was not built around you. The millennial narrative, the one that gets written about in think pieces and debated on cable news, is largely a portrait of a particular class experience within that generation. It assumes a certain kind of upbringing. It assumes parents who attended college open houses with you, who understood how the financial aid system worked, who could tell you what a liberal arts degree was and whether it was worth it. It assumes a specific kind of scaffolding that you did not have. You existed inside the millennial generation, but you did not exist inside the millennial story. The label is technically correct and experientially wrong, and that gap, the gap between the category you are assigned and the life you actually lived, is not a small thing. It is in fact the central psychological fact of your experience. You exist in the gap. Not just between working-class origin and professional destination, but between the culture you came from and the culture you entered, between the person you were raised to be and the person the institution was trying to produce. That gap has a name, and psychology has something very specific to say about it. What you were navigating before you had words for it. Here is what was actually happening during those years. When you arrived on a college campus as the first person in your family to do so, you were not simply pursuing an education, you were undergoing a process of cultural transmission that nobody had prepared you for and nobody around you fully understood, including you. The sociologist Annette Lareau, whose landmark study 2003, Unequal Childhoods, Class, Race, and Family Life, documented the divergent developmental experiences of working-class and middle-class children in America, identified something she called the logic of child-rearing by class. Middle-class parents, Lareau found, practiced what she called concerted cultivation, an active, ongoing effort to develop children's cognitive skills, verbal abilities, and sense of institutional entitlement. They coached their children to negotiate with authority figures, to advocate for themselves, to treat institutions as responsive to individual needs. Working-class parents, by contrast, practiced what Lareau called the accomplishment of natural growth, a model in which children were expected to develop organically with less direct scaffolding, and in which institutions were generally treated as authorities to be respected and not challenged. Neither approach is better or worse as a way of raising a human being, but one of them equipped children with a specific set of institutional skills that college, in the professional world beyond it, was designed to reward. You likely grew up in the second model, and when you arrived at college, you encountered an institution that was built entirely on the first. What that felt like from the inside was not a class analysis. What that felt like from the inside was, something is wrong with me. Everyone else seems to know how this works. They ask questions in office hours like it's easy. They talk to professors like they're peers. They know what a curriculum committee is and why it matters and how to get on it. They seemed to be briefed, and you were not. That feeling, that specific, grinding, exhausting sense of being one step behind a game whose rules everyone else learned somewhere you weren't, has a name. It is not imposter syndrome, although imposter syndrome is part of it. It is something more structural than that. And understanding what it actually is changes what it means about you. The psychology of cultural capital and why you were running a deficit. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu introduced the concept of cultural capital in his 1986 essay, The Forms of Capital. The idea that societies transmit not just economic resources across generations, but also cultural ones, knowledge, behaviors, credentials, dispositions, and modes of speech that function as currency in institutional environments. Cultural capital is not about intelligence, it is not about work ethic, it is about familiarity with the codes that institutions use to sort people, and those codes are transmitted primarily through family. What this means practically is that a student who grew up in a household with college-educated parents arrived on campus already fluent in the unwritten language of academic culture. They knew, implicitly, how to read a syllabus as a negotiation rather than a mandate. They knew that a professor's office hours were not a remedial resource but a networking opportunity. They knew the difference between the kind of question that signals intellectual engagement and the kind that signals unpreparedness. They had absorbed these things the way you absorb your first language, without instruction, through exposure, over years. You had not absorbed them. Not because you were less capable, not because you cared less, but because they were not in the environment you grew up in. There was no mechanism by which they could have reached you. And here is the part that research has confirmed over and over, in ways that should clarify everything you carried through those years. The gap you felt was not imaginary, it was not weakness, and it was not the result of being in the wrong place. It was the predictable, documented outcome of arriving in an institution that was built to recognize and reward a form of capital you were never given. Nicole Stephens and her colleagues at the Kellogg School of Management published research in 2012 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology demonstrating that universities implicitly communicate what they call an independent model of self, an orientation toward individual self-expression, personal exploration, and autonomous choice that aligns with the cultural norms of middle-class, college-educated families. First-generation students, by contrast, arrive with what Stephens describes as an interdependent orientation, one organized around family obligation, community, and collective responsibility. When the institution's implicit norms and a student's implicit self-model are misaligned, Stephens found, it creates a persistent sense of mismatch, a low-level, exhausting background feeling of not belonging that has measurable effects on academic performance, mental health, and ultimately, career trajectory. That feeling of mismatch is what you walked around with, for years, maybe, perhaps until right now. Here is what you need to understand about that. The mismatch was real. It was not in your head. You were not broken or underprepared in any fundamental sense. You were navigating a genuine structural gap, carrying one set of cultural tools into an environment that was calibrated for a different set, and you were doing it without support, without language for what was happening, and without anyone around you who had been through the same thing. That is an enormous thing to have done. The weight of being the one who went. There is a specific burden that first-generation college students carry that is almost never named directly, and it needs to be named here because it shaped you in ways that are still operating in your life. You were not just going to college for yourself. You knew this. Everyone around you knew this. It was spoken and unspoken simultaneously. It was in the way your parents talked about your enrollment to other people, with a particular pride that had a particular weight attached to it, a pride that was also a claim, a hope, sometimes a demand. You were going for the family. You were supposed to be the one who made it. You were the proof that the sacrifices were worth it, the validation that a different kind of life was possible. The person who was going to come back and fix things, or save things, or make things easier. And you believed it. You had to believe it, because the alternative, that you were simply a young person pursuing your own curiosity with no obligation to anyone else, was not a framework your upbringing had made available to you. This is the interdependent orientation that Stephens identified, but it goes even deeper than her research describes, because it is not just that you organized your sense of self around connection to family and community, it is that your educational achievement became entangled with your family's emotional economy in ways that made the stakes of your academic experience much more high than they should have been for any individual student. When you struggled in a class, it was not just about your grade, it was about whether you were going to be able to fulfill the role everyone had assigned you. When you succeeded, the success felt complicated, because success meant moving further from the world you came from, and that felt like a kind of betrayal, even as it felt like an accomplishment. When you changed, and college changes everyone, you felt the change in relation to the people you'd left behind, and sometimes the change felt like loss, and sometimes it felt like abandonment, and you carried the weight of both simultaneously.
There is a specific psychological term for the emotional labor of managing your success in relation to the people you came from. Researchers call it survivor guilt in some contexts, but that framing doesn't quite capture it. What you were experiencing was closer to what the psychologist Geraldine Downey at Columbia University has studied under the concept of rejection sensitivity, except the rejection you were sensitive to was not the institution, but from home. You were afraid, at some level, that you might never have articulated that succeeding too fully would cost you the love and belonging of the people who had made you. That fear did not have to be rational to be powerful. And it was very, very powerful. The double life and what it cost you. Here is what happened in practice. You developed a kind of double fluency. At home, you learned to make yourself legible again, to talk about college without making it feel like a performance, to downplay the things that had changed in you, to be careful with the words you used and the references you made, to monitor yourself constantly for signs that you were becoming someone unrecognizable to the people you loved. You learned to translate yourself downward. At school, you learned to perform a version of belonging that you did not fully feel. You figured out the codes, slowly through observation and error and sometimes humiliation, and you got better at them. You learned to code switch, to sound more polished in seminar, to email professors with the right tone, to walk into institutions with a posture of entitlement you had to consciously construct rather than draw on from somewhere deep. Both of those adaptations were exhausting. Not in a way that was always visible, but in a way that was constant and cumulative, a background tax on your cognitive and emotional resources that other students simply were not paying. The term that has emerged in the research literature for this specific form of labor is code switching, a concept originally developed in linguistics by Jean Gumpertz to describe the practice of alternating between languages or dialects depending on social context. Applied to class identity, it describes exactly what you were doing, managing two different linguistic and behavioral registers, reading your environment constantly for cues about which version of yourself was required, suppressing one set of responses to amplify another. And the research is clear on what sustained code switching costs. Claude Steele, the social psychologist at Stanford who developed stereotype threat theory and whose 2010 book, Whistling Vivaldi, remains among the most important accounts of identity contingency under institutional pressure, documented the performance costs of identity vigilance, the way that belonging uncertainty and the constant monitoring of social cues depletes the same cognitive resources that learning and achievement require. You were not just going to class, you were going to class while managing an ongoing threat assessment, and that assessment was running in the background of every lecture, every discussion section, and every social interaction on campus. You were working harder than almost anyone around you, and most of that work was invisible. The loneliness that didn't have a category. Let's be honest about something that doesn't get said directly in most accounts of this experience. The loneliness was specific
It was not the generic loneliness of a young person away from home for the first time, though that was real too. It was a loneliness of comprehension. The people around you did not understand the life you came from, and the people at home did not understand the life you were building. And you were, for a period of time that may have lasted years, the only person in any room who fully understood both. That is a peculiar and exhausting form of isolation. You could not fully grieve it at home, because home was part of what you were grieving. You could not fully articulate it at school, because articulating it would require making your class origin visible in an environment that rewarded performing invisibility around class, so you carried it alone. The developmental psychologist Mary Waters at Harvard, whose work on immigrant second-generation identity formation has important parallels to first-generation class mobility, describes the experience of living between two cultural worlds as creating what she calls segmented assimilation, an uneven, partial integration in which the person belongs fully to neither world and must construct a self from the available pieces of both. The navigation is not just cognitive, it is emotional and relational and deeply destabilizing. You were building a self in between two worlds that had no overlap and no shared vocabulary, and you were doing it alone, in real time, with nobody to advise you on which pieces to keep and which to let go, because nobody in your life had made the same crossing. The question you were implicitly asking yourself throughout this period was one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in human psychology. Who am I if I am not fully who I was and not yet who I am becoming? That question, unasked and unanswered, is what the loneliness was built on. Identity foreclosure, diffusion, in the millennial first generation. The developmental psychologist James Marcia, building on Erik Erikson's foundational work on psychosocial development, proposed in his 1966 paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology a model of identity formation with four distinct statuses: foreclosure, diffusion, moratorium, and achievement. These categories describe where a person is in the process of constructing a stable, coherent sense of self. Identity foreclosure in Marcia's model is the state of having an identity committed without exploration. Typically, the identity is signed by family of origin. You know who you are because your family, your community, and your social environment have always known who you are, and that knowing has become your own. Many people in your family may have been in a form of foreclosure, not as a failure, but as the natural outcome of a life in which certain questions of identity were never opened for examination because they did not need to be. You arrived at college in something close to foreclosure. You knew who you were, your family's child, your community's representative, the person who worked hard and did not complain and showed up and fulfilled obligations. That identity was stable, functional, and deeply felt. And then the institution began to pull at it, not with malice, but with the ordinary machinery of higher education, which is designed to destabilize what you think you know and make you ask questions you have not asked before. What you experienced as a result was not simply academic adjustment. It was a forced entry into what Marcia called identity moratorium, the active questioning, exploration, and uncertainty that typically precedes achieved identity. The transition was forced rather than chosen, and it happened at a pace and in a context that offered very little support. Here is what identity moratorium actually feels like from the inside. It feels like being unmoored. It feels like the things you used to say with confidence about yourself no longer quite apply, and the new things you are being offered don't quite fit either. It feels like the ground has shifted under a self you thought was solid. It feels sometimes like grief. It feels sometimes like terror. And it happens while you are also trying to pass your organic chemistry exam and figure out how to write a thesis statement and manage the cost of your textbooks. You didn't just go to college, you underwent a developmental rupture at the same time as everyone else was just trying to get through the semester. What home became. Coming home changed after that. It changed the first time, and it kept changing. The first time you came back, the first break, the first summer, you noticed things you had not noticed before. The physical dimensions of the house, the vocabulary at the dinner table, the way your family members talked about institutions, schools, hospitals, government offices, with a particular resignation, a particular assumption of powerlessness that you had absorbed your whole life as normal and that now struck you as something else entirely, something with a name, and a structure, and a cause.
That noticing was the beginning of a particular kind of pain, because noticing meant distance, and distance meant you were becoming someone who looked at the home you came from, rather than someone who simply was it. And you had not asked for that. You had not been warned about it. Nobody had told you that part of what education does is give you a set of analytical tools that you cannot then unapply to your own life. You did not want to see your family differently, but you did. And the guilt of that seeing, the shame of the distance itself, compounded the grief of the transition. You were not just mourning the loss of an old self, you were ashamed of the mourning, because who loses something by gaining something? Who feels grief about education? Who finds something painful about becoming the person their family was so proud of them for becoming? You did, quietly, often alone. Often in the form of symptoms rather than words, a tension that arrived at the holidays and didn't leave, a vague sense of fraudulence that followed you into your professional life, a voice in the back of your mind that said, "You don't actually belong here." That voice, psychology is clear on this, was not telling the truth, but it was reporting something real. It was reporting the friction of a self caught between two worlds, of a person who had crossed a cultural boundary that was built to be difficult to cross, of someone who was doing something genuinely hard and had never once been given permission to name it as hard. The imposter syndrome that wasn't just imposter syndrome. Let's talk about imposter syndrome, because it is almost certainly a word you have applied to yourself, and it is the right word, partly, but it is also an incomplete one. And the incompleteness matters. Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes first described the imposter phenomenon in their 1978 paper in Psychotherapy, Theory, Research, and Practice, based on their clinical work with high-achieving women who were convinced, despite substantial evidence of their competence, that their success was undeserved and that they would eventually be exposed as fraudulent. The concept has since expanded far beyond its original context, and it genuinely applies to first-generation college students, particularly first-generation millennials who entered institutions that had almost no scaffolding for the specific challenges of class-based cultural dislocation. But here is the distinction that matters. Classical imposter syndrome is primarily a cognitive distortion. It is the misreading of real competence as accidental success. In cognitive distortion is the right frame for many of the people who use the term to describe themselves. For you, it was also something structural. The feeling of being an imposter was not purely a misreading of competence, it was also an accurate reading of context. You were in fact unfamiliar with many of the codes and norms of the institution you had entered. You were in fact working without the background cultural preparation that your peers had received. The feeling of being behind was not irrational, it was a reasonable assessment of a real gap. The error was in what you concluded from that assessment, that the gap reflected something about your intelligence or your worth, rather than something about your preparation and your context. Nicole Stephens and her colleagues put it precisely in their research. First-generation students often have accurate perceptions of mismatch, but inaccurate attributions of its cause. They are right that something is off. They are wrong about what that something means. The misattribution towards personal deficit rather than contextual gap is what fuels the imposter feeling,
and it is a misattribution that the institution almost never corrects, because doing so would require the institution to acknowledge that it was designed in a way that disadvantages a particular group of students. You carried that misattribution for a long time, in some form, and it shaped decisions about which opportunities you pursued, which rooms you walked into, which questions you allowed yourself to ask. It shaped the ceiling you set for yourself, sometimes in subtle and invisible ways, sometimes in large and definitive ones.
The professional world and the second crossing. You made it through. You graduated. You crossed the first threshold, the one everyone could see and celebrate. And then there was a second crossing that almost nobody acknowledged because there was almost no language for it yet. The crossing from the first-generation student into the first-generation professional. The skills that got you through college, the code switching, the relentless self-monitoring, the extraordinary capacity for hard work, the ability to read rooms for cues about what was expected, these served you well in survival mode, and you had been in survival mode for so long that you mistook it for a personality. But the professional world asked something else of you too. It asked you to perform the kind of effortless confidence, the kind of casual institutional ease, the kind of relaxed entitlement that your middle-class peers had been developing for their entire lives. It asked you to negotiate raises, to advocate loudly for your ideas in meetings, to build relationships with senior people, not because you needed something from them, but because that was how professional networks worked. To treat your career as a personal project of self-advancement rather than an obligation being fulfilled. And those things did not come naturally, not because you were incapable, but because they ran directly against the cultural values, the interdependence, the humility, the service orientation, the distrust of conspicuous self-promotion that you had been raised inside of. This is documented. The sociologist Lauren Rivera, in her 2015 book, Pedigree: How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs, found through extensive research on elite professional services hiring that cultural signals associated with upper middle-class backgrounds, specific leisure activities, particular social ease, a specific kind of conversational confidence, functioned as implicit screening criteria in hiring decisions, even among evaluators who were explicitly committed to meritocratic values. The cultural capital that should have been irrelevant to professional competence was in practice highly relevant to professional selection. You may have lost opportunities, not because you lacked the skills, but because you lacked the performance, and you may have sensed this without being able to name it, a persistent feeling that the rooms you deserved to be in were not quite fully accessible, that there was some final layer of belonging you could approximate but never fully reach. The tax that never stopped. Here is something that needs to be said plainly, because it is almost never said. The psychological labor of this kind of class crossing does not end with graduation. It does not end with the first job, or the second job, or the promotion, or the house in the neighborhood you could not have grown up in. It changes form. It becomes more sophisticated. You get better at performing institutional fluency, better at code switching, better at reading rooms, but the underlying vigilance, the part of you that is always half scanning for social cues, always half monitoring your own speech for signs that you are about to say something that will mark you as the person who grew up in a different kind of house, that part doesn't simply switch off. Research published by Michael Krauss at Yale, who studies the psychology of social class perception, in whose 2012 paper in Psychological Science with Paul Piff and Dacher Keltner, documented the systematic ways that working-class individuals differ from upper-class individuals in social attention, empathy, and environmental monitoring, offers a partial explanation. Krauss and his colleagues found that lower-class individuals develop a heightened attunement to external context and social cues as a result of their environments in which resources are less certain and social navigation is higher stakes. That attunement does not disappear when the external environment changes. It is a feature of a particular kind of developmental history. The vigilance that made you feel like an outsider in college became over time one of the most sophisticated social intelligences in the room. You read people accurately, you read rooms accurately, you understood power dynamics and institutional cultures in ways that your peers, raised with more certainty about their belonging, sometimes did not. The mechanism that produced so much suffering also produced a remarkable and specific capability. That is not a silver lining. Silver linings are offered too cheaply. It is something harder and truer than a silver lining. It is the recognition that the thing that cost you so much was also building something in you, something real and durable and not easily replicated by people who never had to develop it.
What you actually built. Here is what you became over those years of crossing and code switching and double fluency and carrying both worlds simultaneously. You became someone who can move between contexts with a fluency that most people never develop, not just in terms of social performance, but in terms of actual comprehension. You understand from the inside what it is like to live with material constraint and what it is like to live without it. What it is like to orient your life around collective obligation and what it is like to orient it around individual aspiration. You have been on both sides of a divide that most people in professional life have only ever seen from one side. That dual comprehension is not a small thing. It is in fact one of the most valuable cognitive and empathic capacities a person can have in environments of any complexity, organizational, political, interpersonal. The sociologist William Julius Wilson has written about the particular analytical power that comes from having lived in multiple social worlds. What he describes as a form of sociological double consciousness has direct application to the professional and interpersonal skills of first-generation class migrants. You are not just fluent in two cultures, you understand the translation between them. You also built, through those years of navigating misalignment, an exceptional tolerance for ambiguity. You spent years in an identity moratorium, in a state of unresolved tension between who you were and who you were becoming, and you survived it. More than survived it, you continued to function, to perform, to achieve, while carrying that unresolved tension. That kind of capacity, the ability to hold uncertainty without collapsing it into false resolution, is what psychologists call ambiguity tolerance, and it correlates with some of the most important outcomes in leadership, creativity, and complex problem solving. The people who grew up with more certainty about their place in the world are often less equipped to handle environments of genuine complexity, genuine change, genuine ambiguity. You were trained by your own experience. The training was hard, and it was not fair, and it was not what you would have chosen, but it was training. You built, through those years of code switching, an attunement to other people that is measurably different from the attunement of people who never had to read rooms for survival. Michael Krauss's research on class-based differences in social cognition is relevant here too. The perceptual habits developed in lower-class environments, the heightened attention to others' cues, the reduced reliance on internal dispositional assumptions, the greater accuracy in reading emotional states, represent a form of social intelligence that develops precisely through the conditions you grew up in. Your empathy is not accidental. It is the product of an environment that required you to be socially precise, and that requirement made you better at understanding other people than almost anyone around you. And you built, through the particular loneliness of existing in between worlds, a capacity for independent self-definition that is rare. When neither world claims you fully, when neither set of rules applies cleanly, you were forced to develop your own. You did not get to inherit a ready-made answer to the question of who you are. You had to construct one, and the identity you build from those constructed pieces is more deliberately yours than the identities of people who never had to examine the building materials. The grief that is still there. There is something that still needs to be said about loss, because this narrative, the one that moves from difficulty to strength, can feel, if it is not careful, like it is erasing something real. You lost something. Multiple things, actually. You lost the uncomplicated experience of home, the experience of belonging to the place you came from without analysis, without distance, without that particular ache of noticing. That experience was not available to you after a certain point, and it is not available to you now, and it was not your fault that it left, and it was not a choice, and it was a real loss.
You lost the clarity that comes from a stable, inherited identity. You lost the ease, and it is real ease, whatever else it costs, of knowing who you are because everyone around you has always known who you are. That kind of ground-level certainty about belonging was not available to you, and other people had it, and the gap between their ease and your vigilance was real and exhausting. You may have lost relationships, friendships from home that couldn't survive the distance your education created, not because anyone was unkind, but because you became, in some measurable way, harder to understand from within the world you came from. You may have lost a particular quality of closeness with family members. Not love, love persisted, but the easy comprehension of the person standing in front of you, the sense that you are fully known. That loss is real and specific and sometimes arrives with particular force at family gatherings, in holidays, and moments of transition when you want nothing more than to be exactly where you came from, and you can't quite get there anymore. These losses are not dissolved by the strengths you built. They exist alongside the strengths. They do not cancel each other out. You are allowed to hold them both, the thing you gained and the thing you lost, without having to resolve the tension into a lesson. The grief is not a sign that the crossing was a mistake. It is a sign that you came from somewhere real and that it mattered and that you carry it with you, even now, even here, even as you are reading this and recognizing something you have always known but never quite heard said directly. Now, let's add another layer, because you did not just cross a class boundary during these years, you crossed it during a specific historical moment that added its own particular weight. You were a millennial first-generation college student, which means you likely enrolled in the years between 1999 and 2014, a window that includes the dot-com bust, September 11th, and most consequentially, the 2008 financial crisis and the recession that followed it. The 2008 crash did something specific to the first-generation millennial experience that has not been fully reckoned with. If you graduated in the years between 2008 and 2012, and many of you did, you graduated into a labor market that had collapsed precisely at the moment you were supposed to claim the return on an investment that had cost you and your family enormous amounts of psychic and material capital. The narrative you had been sold, the one that said education was the reliable mechanism of class mobility, that a college degree was the ticket, that the sacrifice was worth it, encountered the hardest possible counter-evidence at the worst possible time. The degree that was supposed to solve the economic precarity you came from did not reliably solve it. And unlike your middle-class peers who were disappointed by a labor market that didn't deliver what they'd been promised, you were also faced with the specific humiliation of potentially returning to the economic starting point your family had sacrificed for you to escape. The weight of that was different. The threat of it was different. The shame of it, the deeply personal sense that you had failed at the thing you were supposed to accomplish, was different. Because the stakes were not just about your individual career trajectory, but about everything the crossing had been for. Researchers studying the psychology of class-based shame, including June Price Tangney, whose work on shame and guilt in Shame and Guilt 2002 distinguishes between the self-correcting pain of guilt and the self-condemning collapse of shame, have documented the particular toxicity of class-based shame, the way it globalizes from a specific failure to a total judgment of the self, the way it is reinforced by the cultural invisibility of class as a legitimate disadvantage, the way it masquerades as individual failing precisely because American cultural mythology insists on the fiction of meritocracy. The story you were living was not a story of individual failure. It was a story of structural timing, of a cohort that did everything right by every available measure and arrived at the finish line to find the economy had rearranged itself. But you may have spent years believing it was something else, and the belief may have cost you in ways that are still accumulating. the identity you carry now. You are older now than you were during those years. You have had time to build, to recover, to reconstruct. You may have a clearer sense of who you are than you did then, but some of what happened in those years is still operating in your present in ways that may be more visible now than they were before. The hypervigilance may still be there, the part of you that reads rooms for class cues, that monitors yourself in professional settings for signs that you are about to say something that reveals your origin. The imposter feeling may arrive in specific contexts, in rooms with a particular quality of institutional prestige, in the presence of people whose ease reads as authority. The grief of home may still show up in particular ways, at holidays, at family events, in the specific dissonance of carrying two worlds that were never designed to coexist inside one person.
These are not pathologies. They are not signs that something went wrong, or that the healing hasn't worked, or that you have not processed your experience adequately. They are the normal, expected residue of a genuine developmental challenge, one that asked more of you than it should have at an age when you were least equipped to meet it, in an environment that provided almost no support for what you were actually going through. The research on what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, developed by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in their 1995 book Trauma and Transformation, suggests that the deepest and most durable forms of psychological strength are often built not despite difficulty, but through it, specifically through the kind of difficulty that forces a fundamental revision of one's understanding of the world and one's place in it. That revision, Tedeschi and Calhoun found, tends to produce greater psychological openness, deeper relationships, a more nuanced appreciation of life, and a stronger sense of personal strength. That is what you built. Not because you had to find the silver lining, not because the difficulty was secretly a gift, but because you met something genuinely hard and you survived it with your capacity for connection, for growth, for self-examination intact. And that survival was not guaranteed, and it was not accidental, and it says something specific and important about who you are. What you are. Let's be direct about this, in the language this deserves. You crossed a boundary that most people never cross. You left a world that made you and entered a world that was not built for you, and you learned to function in it, and you did not stop loving the world you came from, and you did not stop growing into the one you were entering, and you held both of those things at the same time for years without a name for what you were holding. You are someone who has always had to build your own map. You did not get to inherit one. The institutional fluency you have now, the ability to navigate professional environments, to read organizational cultures, to move through rooms with at least the outward appearance of ease, you built that from scratch, every piece of it, without a manual, often in real time, often under observation, often while also managing the emotional labor of everything else you are carrying. You are someone with dual cultural fluency. That means you can speak two languages that most people cannot translate between. That means you understand from the inside the experience of people on both sides of a divide that this society pretends does not exist. That means you have capacities for empathy, for translation, for organizational insight that cannot be taught in any classroom and that many of your peers will never develop. You are someone who built an identity under conditions that required it to be built deliberately rather than inherited passively. The self you are is more explicitly yours, more chosen, more examined, more consciously constructed than the selves of people who never had to question the building materials. You are not undamaged. Nobody gets through what you went through without carrying something. The grief is real. The vigilance is real. The moments when the imposter feeling arrives uninvited are real. You do not have to pretend otherwise. But you are not a deficit. You were never a deficit. The gap you were living in was a structural condition, not a personal failing. The difficulty you experienced was real difficulty.
not weakness. The identity crisis was a genuine developmental rupture, not an overreaction. And the person who came out the other side of it, the person who can hold two worlds, who can read any room, who built a self from scratch in between two cultures that had no shared vocabulary, that person is something. That person is you. You know this. You have known it in some form for years. You just needed someone to say it directly. Now you have it in words. If this finally named something you've been carrying, the next video goes into a part of this generation's psychology that almost nobody has addressed directly, the specific way that first-generation millennials experience success, why achievement so often comes packaged with anxiety rather than satisfaction, and what the research says about why the arrival never feels like arrival. Subscribe so you don't miss it.